Hello, and welcome back to Local Writers Read July event. We are here for part 2 of our theme of borders with 3 more readers to hear from. We had a great start to the event last night, so if you missed that, feel free to go back and watch the video. And if you did see it, thank you for coming back in today. As always, I will be watching the comments for the discussion today. So if you have anything you want to say to our readers or any questions you'd like to ask, feel free to add those in. And if you're new to our series, Local Writers Read features Maine writers reading across genres in poetry, fiction, nonfiction, with the occasional out-of-state guests who we're able to bring in. And so without further ado, I will hand things over to Claire Guyton, my co-organizer, and we will start off today's event.
Great. So today, we have 2 friends of the reading series joining us, Sue Repko and Jen George. Thank you, ladies. And a big Local Writers Read welcome to our new friend, Anne Elliott. Sue will start us off with an essay that navigates the new physical and psychic borders we've all been navigating in 2020. Sue's essays have been named notable in the Best American Essays and have appeared in Hazlitt, the Southeast Review, The Common, and Aquifer. She teaches English at Phillips Exeter Academy in New Hampshire and is at work on a memoir about her father and an unintentional shooting. Next, we'll hear from Jen, whose short story protagonist fantasizes about crossing one particular border with one particular man. Jen teaches at Southern Maine Community College and Unity College. Her poetry has appeared in Muse and Stone Coast Review, and her fiction in the Ginger Collect and Silver Pen's Youth Imagination. Her short story collection, Beauty and the Broken, was published by the Foundry Publishing Company. Jen has an obsession with wide, clear skies, the open road, and the blurry line between madness and the supernatural. Anne will read a fiction excerpt with the protagonist living quietly on a border between before and after while she considers her next step. Anne is the author of the story collection, The Art Stars, which was a finalist for this year's Maine Literary Awards, and her fiction appears in the current issues of Story, which also includes an author interview, and A Public Space. She's a 3-time finalist for the Maine Literary Award and a current fiction candidate at the MFA program for writers at Warren Wilson College. Find more about Anne and her work at AnneElliottStories.com. That's Anne with an E and Elliott with 2 L's and 2 T's, AnneElliottStories.com. So again, thank you all for sharing your work with us today, and we may as well get started. So Sue, I think you're up.
Thank you to Claire, Josh, Courtney, who is not here, Lewiston Public Library and Quiet City Books for hosting this series. I'm very glad to be reading with Jen and Anne this afternoon. I'll be reading an essay. It's called The Virus Talking. Today, I am recalling January, thumbing through my day planner, trying to pin this down, trying to put brackets around it. On Monday, January 27th, 2020, I fly from Portland, Maine to Pittsburgh to visit family. The trip requires 2 flights, and I wear a mask in both planes. In one of the airports and on one of my flights, I see 2 different men also wearing masks, and I am grateful for the momentary locking of our eyes, our mouths inscrutable. 3 days later, I return from Pittsburgh, again with a mask. This time, though, I am alone. I feel a little self-conscious, but not enough to alter my behavior. A defiant masker has already been born. I got it at a doctor's appointment on Wednesday, January 8th. It was a follow-up for blood pressure. As I approached the check-in counter, my eye caught the station set up with sanitizer and a box of masks. "Take one if you're coughing or sneezing or have a fever," said the sign. I slipped one in my pocket and pumped sanitizer into my palm, because why not? I share this not to show how clever or prescient I was, but how a circuit breaker of anxiety had already tripped. Prior to that appointment, I had read a story in the New York Times that puzzled over a strange pneumonia-like illness in Wuhan, China. There was no evidence that it was spreading from person to person, the story said, and more research was necessary. But it then proceeded to note that people from Hong Kong and South Korea who had recently been to Wuhan seemed to be coming down with the same symptoms. In an instant, my non-scientific mind envisioned this coronavirus hopping on other people, getting onto other planes, and spreading around the world. Severe acute respiratory syndrome was mentioned. SARS, in quotes, spread from southern China in 2003 and infected more than 3,000 people, killing 774, end quote. Those numbers were meant to sound alarm bells. But I only vaguely remember hearing about SARS back then. What was I even doing in 2003? Driving my sons here and there, writing short stories, fretting and fuming over Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld and wars for oil. SARS was some faraway virus that had nothing to do with me. In January 2020, though, a couple news articles untether my propensity to what if. What if there is a virus from the other side of the world already floating in the air in Maine, in Pennsylvania? What if it's already here? These are the starting points for this particular strain of anxiety that is mutating all the time. It has already been 6 months. A legitimate vaccine could be just 12 more months away. What we've already been through times 2, I can do that. We can do this. I can do no writing in the room in my house, formerly known as my office. It's really a charming room with sloped ceilings and 2 low windows that look out onto a pool and some lovely flower beds that riot with black-eyed Susans in summer, all courtesy of the former owners. Maybe it's the piles of papers and books from teaching from the year before, gun violence prevention materials, research and drafts for the never-ending memoir in progress, the taxes, the junk mail, the unread magazines. I can't think in there anymore, can't finish my book with the ceiling the way it is, closing in on me. In January and February during this sabbatical year, I take to writing in my favorite coffee shop, working my way finally through a very detailed outline of my memoir. I have established its borders. I will not let it pull me down every rabbit hole. I will stick to my note cards. Discipline. Early in March, though, when it starts to become clear that COVID-19 is indeed here, and I come to think of the nice people in the coffee shop as possible disease vectors, I decamp to the room in the house that my partner calls the library, because for the longest time it had the only built-in bookshelf in the house. I insist on calling it the living room, one of those rooms where some people, including us, put the good furniture that no one ever uses. We have another room with another sofa that he calls the Florida room because it has a tile floor and a high ceiling and lots of windows, which is where we watch TV and nap and keep the houseplants, but which I call the family room. Only it's usually just the 2 of us, and my family is far away, and now I don't know if or when I'll ever see them again. My mother, my sons, my brothers and sisters and their families, and all my friends back in Pennsylvania and New Jersey and a lot of other places now that I think about it. And this is not hyperbole, that I may never see them again. That's the virus talking. The library living room where I work has a normal height ceiling and 4 normal size windows. When I sit at the very simple table in there with my laptop, I can look out 2 of the windows onto our side yard on land once inhabited and cared for by the Abenaki people. I see a couple of apple trees and cardinals and blue jays flitting this way and that at a nearby feeder. Sometimes wild turkeys struck by, every member of their large families bobbing and pecking. They fan out and regroup. They are together in the ways they've always been together, in what is apparently known as a rafter. They seem to have no idea what's going on in Italy and New York City. I bet they're all going to make it to the other side of this. I never thought I'd envy wild poultry. I gravitate toward reading articles on my phone, reaching for it as soon as I awaken in the mornings and my heart starts to race. I buy books to support local bookstores, but after they are delivered and spend time on the decontamination bench in the garage for a couple days, I move them to the growing piles crowding the floor next to my bed, half started, half finished. What's the difference? No, really. I start a blog. Welcome to my COVID-19 chronicle, where I try to remain balanced physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually through this crisis. I hope this journal will provide another bit of human connection wherever you may be on this fragile planet of ours at this particular moment in time. The first posts appear on, let me go back and look that up, March 16th. No posts appear after April 1st. Apparently, I can't keep up the positive patter for more than a couple weeks. Look at what I baked. Look at the Mother Nature I saw today. I lose track of time. There's a sameness to the days, the house, and the walks, encountering neighbors I've never seen before, the tentative hellos, then the curl back into my head. I get into the habit of checking the pantry closet and the bench near the dining table where I now keep cans of beans and tuna. Canned goods remind me of my childhood when we always had a solid stash of green beans, corn, and peas. As an adult, I much prefer frozen vegetables when the fresh run out. Now I like to open the spare refrigerator in the garage and see the yogurts and cartons of oat milk lined up. In the early days of the lockdown, we stocked up on cauliflower, carrots, and Brussels sprouts, root vegetables that we'd keep. I like to keep tabs on our dwindling supplies, even as fear of deprivation creeps in. What if he or I got sick today? Would the other have enough of this or that to see them through? At first, our groceries last for 3 weeks. Then on the next trip, I say, let's go for 4. I consider it a sort of dry run for the apocalypse. Only it's not a dry run. When fear and urgency compel me, I buy from the evil empire. Sanitizer, face mask, gloves, thermometers, pulse oximeters, face shields. I ship various supplies to my mother and my sons until one of them says, stop. As spring limps into view, I order 3 yards of mulch. Since we moved here 5 years ago, I have taken on the responsibility of not letting the prior owner's unbelievable flower gardens be destroyed by my incompetence or laziness. Of course, I love to look at the successive blooming of all kinds of plants I still can't name, but I remain an unenthusiastic flower gardener. Except this year, I will re-etch the border around the beds out front to give them that finished professional look. Whenever I need a break from my writing or from the news, there is always a pile of mulch, a shovel, and a wheelbarrow waiting for me on those mostly raw days. I realize this is a privilege. All I have to do is keep moving and keep moving the mulch from the driveway to the beds. And when that first load is gone, I order another. I realize that keeping up appearances is all about the illusion of control. I move the mulch anyway. At some point in April, I have to stop reading every article about this virus. There are a lot of numbers being bandied about for every delineated, populated region on the planet. Cases, positives, presumptive positives, ventilators, ICU beds, deaths, and the body's devastation and sorrow piling up. We can no longer properly count, no longer properly gather to put a prayer around the end of a life, no longer contain any of it. It seems COVID-19 is everywhere, except if you're one of those people who thinks it isn't. You gotta love the armed white men flocking to state houses across the US, protesting governmental orders to wear masks, all bunched together on the steps like lost children in a deep, dark wood, holding signs that say, my body, my choice. They have no idea how hilarious they are. They probably haven't read the articles about the crystallized lung tissue in COVID patients who aren't going to make it. It looks like glass, or maybe snowflakes. On second thought, you don't have to love them. I find myself unusually concerned with what I cannot see. How to set up a border between my nasal passages, mouth and eyes, and you and your droplets. Some universal you and your. Those first few trips to the grocery store, I gear up, strategize, plan how I will move swiftly through my list and through the store. I don't see the other customers as people. They are obstacles, purveyors of respiratory droplets to be given wide berth or avoided completely, if I can come at the bran flakes from the other end. This is before stores start hurting us with painted arrows on the floors, while it is still a kind of Wild West, and the sheriffs among us are sheathed in gloves, masks, and the moral rectitude that we think disguises the fear that makes us twitchy and snappish. What are you looking at, you unmasked breather? My partner has 2 N95 masks in his woodworking shop, one for him, one for me. At first, this is what I use to go grocery shopping, and I treat it with reverence because I'm reusing it. Later, when some of the cheaper surgical masks become available again, I use those with a cloth mask on top, preserving the N95 for when things get really bad, because it's going to get bad again before there's a vaccine. That's what Dr. Fauci and Dr. Gupta and all the real doctors say on TV and all the real epidemiologists and all the real articles. I know that the whole point of a mask is for the wearer to protect those around her by containing her own droplets, but I can't stop myself from feeling that I'm also protecting myself. Even after I read the article about how well each type of mask and the various types of materials stop or don't stop the spread of various size droplets. Nothing works 100%. That's when I order the plastic face shields. There doesn't seem to be a shortage of them now, but you just wait till October. I haven't used them yet, though. I'm not that far gone. I can do no writing on the days we shop for groceries, wash the groceries, put away the groceries. I must lie down afterward in the Florida family room with Andrew Cuomo murmuring reassurances on low. Are my friends in New York okay today? I need to call my mom when I wake up. In May and June, I allow myself cautious entry at home improvement stores and gardening centers, weaving around people like the point guard I used to be. Vegetable gardening is one of my hobbies. Well, no, it might be my only hobby, besides worrying. I really need to get more healthy hobbies. I tried to start to learn French. What month was that? I did yoga twice. The ukulele I got for Christmas sits untouched in the room where I write. In the hardware store, I look for protective eyewear for when I use the weed whacker. And I remember about the droplets and pick up a pair of goggles and also a pair of safety glasses that look like the very sporty sunglasses of a mountain biker or marathoner. Only their lenses are clear, very clear. I pretend I can see the world as it really is and believe my eyes to be safe from the spray of invaders. That is, the anti-maskers. I go to one Black Lives Matter protest and stand around the edges and chant into my mask and take pictures and cheer on the marchers. I want to be among them. Our righteous anger's joined. I want Black and brown people to be safe from the police and from this virus. At maine.gov, under phase 2, large social gatherings, updated on June 17th, it says, projection of respiratory particles is increased during singing, yelling, dancing, sports, and games. Exposure to respiratory droplets with such activities increases the transmission risk of COVID-19 to attendees, particularly in crowded areas and indoor settings. I can't imagine actually doing any of this, even though my thoughts themselves sing and yell and dance, and they are crowded, very crowded in my head. I wish we all could be very still for a very long time, or at least as long as it takes. One day, I want to walk with the wild turkeys on the other side. Thank you. Oh, and I guess Jen is up next. Yes, Jen George.
Closing the chat. Okay. This is a story called New Mexico, George Clooney. And it is, well, it's a story of a different kind of border. Maybe someone on the edge of snapping, as well as wanting to go to the far borders of this country. So here we go. Marianne Hart had just clocked out when the tornado siren started screaming. Mulling over whether to stay put or chance the drive home, she stepped into the employee ladies' room and changed from her prisoner orange Savor's Choice uniform polo to a pink t-shirt. When she was off the clock, Marianne didn't want any reminders of a place that owned her 39 hours a week and not 1 minute more. Besides, if a tornado came down and her number came up, she didn't want to go out looking like she belonged in the county jail. Tornadoes were common in that part of Illinois, practically a spectator sport. People sat on their porches with iced tea and cameras, filming twisters until their own properties were in danger. Savor's Choice had never been hit, but today, the sky looked like it might open up and suck the whole 100,000 plus square foot store right off the ground like some kind of nightmare vacuum cleaner. Even though she had grown up watching the wind swirl, a little wad of uneasiness sat in Marianne's stomach. All morning, Marianne had watched through the front windows as the boiling green-black clouds cast a sickly twilight over the store, making the parking lot lights switch on. 2 funnel clouds had touched down just outside of Pekin the day before, and the badly damaged Route 29 bridge was closed. Half of the town was without power, but idiots were still out on the roads ramming into each other when the signals were down. If Mary Ann had her druthers, she would be one of the idiots out on the road, only she wouldn't be in Pekin, Illinois. She would be across the country with George Clooney heading into New Mexico in a convertible with a cloud of dust trailing behind them. They would find a house, or heck, even a trailer in the middle of the desert and hole up with their loot, leaving the rest of the world to itself. Before a heart attack took her husband Jerry at 56 years old, he and Mary Ann had planned to buy an RV and spend their retirement years motoring around the Southwest. Now, Mary Ann was left with nothing but pictures of places she hoped to visit someday and a 30-year-old son who refused to grow up and move out of the house. So much for the golden years. But she didn't want to think about that. Back to her mantra, George Clooney, New Mexico. The machine gun popping of gum had brought Mary Ann back to attention. She peeled her eyes away from the clouds and blinked a few times before greeting a woman who wore a tan from a can and her hair thrown up in a tangled knot on her head. She thumped a case of bottled water onto the conveyor belt. The case was ripped open with some bottles missing. This is pathetic, the gum popper huffed. There's like no water left, and what is there is like this. The woman flipped the flap of the torn plastic wrap. Mary Ann nodded and murmured something that sounded like an apology as she rang up the water with a 30% discount. The woman harumphed and muttered as she paid. New Mexico, George Clooney. In her daydreams, George Clooney didn't care that she was a 59-year-old widow who worked full-time at a minimum wage job when she could have been living off her husband's army pension until Social Security checks started up because her drug-addicted kid was still using her as a meal ticket. No, George Clooney was on the lam from the law like his character in that heist movie, hiding with a trunk full of money from Vegas in the middle of nowhere down some abandoned road, and he wanted her to be a part of his adventures. The image of a gray-black highway weaving around buttes on a wide red landscape brought her blood pressure down. She repeated her mantra in her mind whenever she got fed up with anyone. Maybe running off to New Mexico really was what she needed to do, even if George Clooney wasn't there. As a little private joke last year, she'd put an oval NM decal on the back of her car, right where she would see it every time she left work. It was comforting to know that the open road was there for her should she ever get the courage and the opportunity to use it. New Mexico, George Clooney. New Mexico, George Clooney. A light tap on Mary Ann's shoulder made her jump and knocked the little bottle of hand sanitizer off the counter by her register. She quickly bent over to pick it up, feeling uncomfortable resistance in her back as she did so. Sorry, didn't mean to scare you. It was Fritz. The bags under his eyes looked big enough to cost extra on flights. His bright green customer service manager vest stretched tight across his gut, which had been much smaller when he was a checker like she was, before he was exposed to the fast food, high-stress life of retail management. He'd been at work since 11 o'clock the night before because his replacement had a tree fall on her house 40 miles away. Fritz had been left to manage the waves of nervous shoppers emptying the shelves of anything that seemed like it would be useful in an emergency. No, it's all right. How are you, Fritz? I'm good. I think maybe you should go home and check on your family. This storm looks bad. Fritz kept his voice low with his head tilted close to hers. His breath smelled like garlic and old coffee, but she didn't mind. Anyone's breath would stink if they didn't get to brush their teeth for a whole day. My family's away, hon, she said. They're over in Indiana for the week. The girlfriend's parents live there. And you've been here since yesterday. Why don't you go rest for a little while? He shook his head. Not yet. Someone's coming over from Decatur to help out, but you can go home. You've already put in 40 hours this week and you can't go overtime. Tony's here. He'll take your register. Okay, Mary Ann said, masking her excitement at a day to herself at home with a shrug. Since you're twisting my arm. Fritz put a hand lightly on her shoulder. You're the most reliable person I know. We need you. Be safe. I always am, she answered with a pat on his hand. In the break room, Mary Ann slung her purse over her shoulder and slipped her stretchy keychain around her wrist. She crossed the store toward the main exit, turning her shoulders this way and that to get around the clumps of storm spectators near the windows. Outside the windows, the pear trees planted to comply with the city's green space ordinance were bowing so deeply they looked like they might snap in half. Mary Ann stopped. She was too close to the glass. Her feet wouldn't move, though. She'd never quite seen a tree bend at that angle. She suddenly needed to pee. Fritz's voice rose above the whooshing wind. Move back from the windows, please, everyone. If you could make your way back, a little farther back, behind the registers. He was standing between the people in the windows, his hands raised. Most people weren't moving, and finally Fritz let out an exasperated, "You guys, please!" The sirens and the wind stopped all at once. Fritz turned around, took one look at the sky, and then looked wildly around the room, nostrils flaring, his shoulders and collarbone pulled up and down with the strain of his arrhythmic, frantic breathing. He met Mary Ann's eyes, and instead of her casual, glib supervisor friend, she saw a wild, terrified little boy. Her feet came unglued from the floor. She ran the width of the store back to the employees-only hallway. The lights flickered twice and went out. A scream rippled through the people in the store. Mary Ann felt her way back to the employee restrooms. The floor was rumbling like it used to back when she was young and lived in that tiny house next to the train tracks. She slammed the single toilet ladies' room door and locked it, knowing the lock always stuck and she could get trapped. A squeezing feeling in her chest and head said that her blood pressure was too high. She couldn't get a deep enough breath despite gasping for air. She crouched underneath the sink, holding onto its pipe for balance. The rumbling got more violent, shaking the whole room, the whole store. Then came that awful sound people describe as a freight train, but in real life was something much worse than that. The roar of winds, the shattering of glass, the thudding of nature's wrecking ball slamming around as the steel roof was peeled off the store like the lid of a sardine can. That was no train. The sink began to gurgle, and the toilet flushed itself. Mary Ann's ears popped painfully. She whimpered from her hiding spot and began chanting, "New Mexico, George Clooney, New Mexico, George Clooney, New Mexico, George Clooney." The locked bathroom door rattled as the wind tried to suck it off its hinges. Her bladder finally let go. "New Mexico, George Clooney, New Mexico, George Clooney." Something thumped her on the back, and the pain shot in every direction. "George Clooney," she screamed, even though she couldn't hear herself. "Oh God, George Clooney!" And then there was nothing. Mary Ann was still whispering, "New Mexico, George Clooney," but the words were just that, words. After a while, she opened her eyes. "New Mexico, George Clooney." She heard her own heartbeat in her ears, fast but strong. Here and there, crashes and screams sounded. She lay on her side in her wet jeans with her bent arm cradling her head, imagining George Clooney in this tiny space with her, spooning her, reassuring her that she was okay. The quiet was strange with no music piping through the little speakers around the store. Time to get out of here. Mary Ann wasn't hurt. She was, however, cold and getting wetter. A pipe must have broken on the soaked floor. Something lay against the wall over her head, making a weird sort of lean-to against the sink. She rolled over and put her knees up under her body in a folded up position she had not been able to get into in a few years, and pushed herself up. Grunting softly with her mouth closed, Mary Ann turned around and pressed her hands against the thing that was overhead. The slightly greasy, slightly sticky wood against her hands could have been nothing other than that old wooden restroom door. She pushed hard against it in spite of her legs and arms feeling like jello, and braced her rear end against the sink. With one more good hard push, it fell away from her, but not before one end slid and whacked her ankles. She hollered but did not curse the door. That stupid thing had saved her life. Daylight streamed through parts of the tattered ceiling like leafy tree branches. The wall it had been attached to lay in pieces around a copy machine, and a fluorescent light fixture poked through the wall next to the toilet. Carefully, Mary Ann stepped onto the fallen door, testing each step and holding on to parts of interior wall frames for balance until she got used to the feeling of walking over the unsteady surface of the door propped on, well, whatever it was propped on. Her ankles felt stiff, maybe swollen, but they weren't broken. Something tugged at her elbow and she shook it off. It thumped to the ground with a jangle of change, and she realized she had just thrown her purse onto the wet floor. With a scoff, she picked it up again and slung its long strap around her chest. Her car keys were still on her wrist, their stretchy chain unbroken. Making her way down the hallway took some doing. After crawling over the wall of lockers that had fallen on its face, she climbed over upended chairs, pieces of twisted metal she couldn't identify, dropped ceiling tiles, and a tangled mass of fabric. Her throat ached, so she could only whisper, "Good Lord, oh my God, George Clooney in New Mexico." When she came out of that little hole of a hallway, she was standing outside. Savor's Choice was mostly gone. Merchandise was thrown everywhere. Some shelves leaned against others with clothing racks on top of them. The self-check area was still there, but the middle of the store was a pile of rubble. The walls at the north and south ends of the store stood like end zones of a very odd, very messy football field. Some shelves stood as well, looking unaffected. People wandered around those areas, some wrapped in blankets or coats or whatever they could find lying around. Others climbed over debris in the middle of the store, probably looking for other people. Marianne stood still, taking in the whole scene. Ambulance and fire truck sirens wailed in the distance. Then she caught sight of a tiny bit of bright green underneath a pile of who knew what a few feet away from her. "Fritz," she whispered. "Oh, God." She hurried over, tripping over chunks of concrete, and dropped to her knees. "Fritz," she called hoarsely. "Fritz, can you hear me?" She began pulling things off her friend, flinging merchandise and glass and wood and concrete chunks as though they weighed nothing. Other pairs of hands began digging with her. She didn't acknowledge them. She kept digging. Fritz was the only person she cared about in this stupid place, and she was going to get him out. Finally, someone said, "I see his head. Quick, help me get this." More voices talked all at once. "Grab here. We need one more guy. Okay, get over here. Okay, ready. 1, 2, 3. They lifted a section of orange-painted metal ceiling beam off Fritz's head, or what was left of it. His forehead was dented in like a deflated basketball, and trickles of blood came from his nose and ears. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly. Marianne didn't scream. She sat back on her heels with part of a concrete block in her hands. She didn't notice someone taking away the block or lifting her to her feet. She stared at Fritz with the same wide stare that was on his lifeless face. Someone put her arm around their shoulders and started to pull her away from the pile of debris. She shuffle walked, letting them lead her off to the end zone. Someone else put a damp jacket around her shoulders. It was cold at first, but it warmed up quickly against the heat of her body. "You okay, ma'am?" someone asked. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" She didn't answer. Someone else, someone who looked like an EMT with vinyl gloves, came up to her and asked her if she was all right. She answered in nods and grunts. He shone a little flashlight in her eyes, and she squinted and turned her head. The man patted her on the shoulder and moved on to the next person, while a girl in pajama pants slid an arm around her and kept it there. After a long time, and without any thought whatsoever, Marianne stood up, turned toward the parking lot, and stumbled away from the remains of Saber's choice. She did not thank the woman who sat with her. She did not glance back at Fritz's sheet-covered body being lifted into a body bag. She eventually dropped the Gatorade bottle, and while she knew she dropped it, she didn't bend down to pick it up. The parking lot lay like a little kid's bedroom after a rough game of Hot Wheels. Cars and light poles and shopping carts were strewn every which way beneath the clearing sky. Marianne walked through the nonsensical maze of vehicles and carts, past flashing lights of fire trucks and ambulances, past the sign for aisle D4, which was the only pole standing in the lot, its back to school savings banner waving loosely in the wind, tethered at one corner by a zip tie. Beyond the tangle of cars, Taco Bell sat untouched. So did McDonald's. The farthest part of the parking lot, the back 40, as the employees called it, had only a little debris here and there. The cars were still parked in their spots. Marianne's white 2010 Honda Civic sat in its spot facing Taco Bell, just as she had left it in the morning. She shoved away the shopping cart resting against the newly dented back bumper, just below the oval NM decal. She got into the car and sat with her eyes closed and her back to the wreckage that had been her place of employment just that morning. When she opened her eyes again, she saw George Clooney's face. All at once, she let out a scream and a laugh. A soggy People magazine was plastered to her windshield, George Clooney's grinning face staring at her from the cover. "Of course," she wailed. "Of course you would show up now, George." Wailing laughter rasped out of her aching throat for a long time after the tears dried up. At long last, she got out of the car, took the magazine off the windshield, and tossed it into the passenger seat. She got in again and started the engine, backing out of her parking spot, heedless of the shopping carts she hit, and wove her way out of the parking lot. She pointed her car west on Illinois Route 9 and pressed down on the gas pedal. She had to swerve around some signs, an uprooted tree, and a few cars on the road, but she did so without even thinking about it. It was almost as though the car was moving on its own. Passing her neighborhood, she saw that not a single house was standing. She didn't bother stopping to see if anything was worth saving. She instead glanced down at the magazine next to her, gave a chuckle of disbelief, and continued on toward Santa Fe. Thanks. And up next we have Anne.
Hi, thanks so much to Claire and Josh for inviting me to read, and I've really enjoyed getting to know the work of all the other readers. It's kind of a treat to read last, and that way I can just express my appreciation for everyone else. I wish we were at Quiet City Books, but thanks to all of you now and in the future who are watching this, either via Facebook Live or elsewise. The story I'm going to read from, rereading it, I discovered it was full of borders. I even used the word border, and I had been thinking of the borders between us and the non-human beings who don't recognize our borders. But then I started realizing there's a lot of intentional boundaries between people in this story, and that's my interpretation of border. What you need to know before this excerpt, it's set in Brooklyn, New York in about the year 2000. And Bee and Irv have just sent their youngest kid, Sadie, off to college in a different time zone. Their other daughter, Nina, has dropped out of college to live in Israel. And Irv talks to Nina every morning, but Bee has been avoiding her for reasons that are not quite clear yet. So, excerpt from Volunteer. Bee generally did her best to disappear while Irv was in session. Patients entered through the main front door and worked with Irv in a porch-like room up front behind a pocket door. It was private. Nonetheless, the nearest bathroom was off the dining room, and patients didn't need to bump into family members along the way. It had been harder when the kids were little, trying to keep them quiet in the kitchen. They used to make a game of it, tiptoeing through the living room to the stairs or the front door. Later, keeping quiet was habit, broken only by sudden arguments between the girls, which hadn't happened for at least 3 years since Nina had gone off to college. That evening, Bee went into Irv's office to wait for Sadie's call. It was quiet, if you wanted it to be, shuttered windows and filled bookshelves insulating the walls. The air conditioner was a pleasant white noise. Bee came here often after supper, especially in summer. It was the only air-conditioned room in the house. Bee objected to air conditioning, a luxury, a waste of power. But on hot nights, her principles faded, and she would find herself lying on the patient's couch to read or to close her eyes and try to imagine what patients said from this spot. Irv never spoke of them in detail. Bee did not ask. She knew that one of his patients, a young man named Trevor, had been hospitalized last year. What did Trevor talk about, this mere boy, Sadie's age, who lay on this couch wishing his own death? Bee tried to slow her heart, watch the quiet cordless phone rise and fall on her chest. Bee, let's order, I'm starved. Irv walked into his office in nothing but his blue Speedo-style briefs. This would be Irv's summer uniform, if propriety allowed. His round belly sagged over the waistband, snowy beard, fluffy eyebrows, tan skin, and ubiquitous white body hair, which used to make the girls laugh and call him Mr. Yeti. I'm going to skip ahead in the story to the next day. Everything took effort for Bee today, every pose on this faded sticky mat. She heard Irv at the front door greeting the day's first patient. She waited to hear his office door slide closed, then went down to the kitchen. Her bran cereal tasted like mulch. She tapped her spoon restlessly against the kitchen table. She washed her bowl, then Irv's. Lord forbid he could wash a bowl. She turned off the faucet. The silent room sickened her. She decided to go check on the garden plots. Sadie's morning glories tangled up and over the chain link fence next to her plot, hundreds of green hearts crazy for the hot air. Bee had not visited the garden in 3 whole weeks, preoccupied with Sadie's readiness. Plenty happens in 3 warm weeks when one is not looking. Now among the healthy, aggressive leaves were pods, dried berries, each bearing a star of seeds like wedges of orange inside a dry skin. Bee had never wanted morning glories here at all, but it caved to Sadie's enthusiasm years ago. It went against the ethos of the community garden. Natives only, no invasives, managed growth. For 8 years, there had been no need to plant morning glory. It sowed babies, generations of flowers, mutating to darker purple each summer. Bee trimmed back the vines and clipped the pods she could find into a bucket so they wouldn't end up in the compost. That would put her on the garden's shit list. Randy, Bee's longtime friend, a middle-aged tomboy and one of the garden's founders, kept tabs on everybody's habits, logged garden gossip, especially about Mr. Patel, who kept to himself, though his plants crept through borders and up fences, self-sowed in neighboring plots. Bee stole looks over her shoulder as she clipped the pods. Randy wasn't around today. Mr. Patel was harvesting his bright zucchini over in the far corner. They were beautiful zucchini. Bee had noticed them with jealousy on her way in, wondering if he fed them chemical fertilizer, another of Randy's pet peeves. Beside the morning gloried fence was Sadie's old pizza garden, a round raised bed with herbs and tomatoes grown in wedges like slices of pie. Her father's daughter, Sadie herself had seen the idea in a magazine and taken the initiative to order seeds from the catalog back when she was 11. Bee had been proud. That summer, Sadie had cried when the tomatoes were munched by horrible, ugly hornworms practically overnight. Honey, I'm so sorry. Let's save some seeds. We'll try again next year with lots of marigolds to chase the bugs away. It had been a disappointment for Sadie, but Bee relished the memory and her daughter's flop into her side for comfort. By the next summer, Sadie had grown inches and toughened, turned to friends her own age for support, would never be seen in her mother's arms in public. She came less often to the plot. Bee had picked off the occasional hornworms herself that season. This year's tomatoes were rebelliously striking. Heirlooms open pollinated for several years, some of them giant new breeds, bursting skins of yellow and orange and red. Bee picked a dozen pretty ones and set them on the bricks edging Sadie's circle, then went to her own plot to work on flowers. What kind of tomatoes are those? The voice startled her. It was Mr. Patel, bending over to inspect the ready fruit she had picked. Well, they have no name. My daughter's own variety. Beautiful, ripened on the bush, the best way. His voice had the musical lilt of his home country, high and warm. Take some if you want. We won't be able to eat all of them, Bee said, not looking up from the stems of echinacea she was clipping to take home and arrange. She was afraid to get too friendly with Mr. Patel, could hear Randy already whispering in her ear, he plants mint, for God's sake, mint, the nerve. And he just lets his winter squash climb up the poor cedar tree. By the time Bee stood up to face him, Patel was gone. On the brick edging, several young zucchini sat in place of the tomatoes he had quietly accepted. Home, Bee walked up the brownstone steps, loaded down with a mesh bag of vegetables and a thick purple bouquet. The door opened and a young man exited. His brown eyes were puffy and rimmed in red, his face pale and gaunt. His long hair was ashen and greasy in need of a wash. Still, it had a gentle, wild curl that caught in the sun, giving the young man a delicate, dangerous air, like a little gypsy girl on a postcard. I'm sorry, Bee said, stepping to the side. The house rule was to avoid the stoop at the turn of the hour when patients were coming and going. You're carrying a sea monster, he said. A what? Bat. He pointed to the spiky cone at the center of an echinacea bloom. Or maybe it's just a flower that flipped itself inside out, a flip-out flower. He laughed at his own observation. Bee laughed along, nervously. The young man hopped down the steps, both feet together, then strode up the block, swinging his arms. He was tall, skinny, clothes draped from his frame as if confused, used to a snug fit, and a heavy unbuttoned coat, too, far too heavy for the season. Bee wore only a light tank dress. I'm sorry, Bee repeated to Irv as she closed the door behind her. I ran into your patient outside. He was rude? Rude? Heavens, no. He said these were sea monsters, flip-out flowers. Irv shook his head, followed her into the kitchen, and watched her unroll the bouquet from its newspaper wrap. Hey, is that boy the one who... That's Trevor, yes. The firmness of his jaws told Bee she was pushing it. Bee changed the subject. Zucchini, beauties, she said, holding up the mesh bag, from one of the other gardeners. Nice, Irv said, though his mind had left the room, or maybe never entered it. Bee shrugged and filled a vase with cold water, letting the gushing sound fill where conversation couldn't. Sadie's absence was felt most at supper. Bee served in the dining room like any old night. The table was half naked with only 2 plates, and the giant vase of flip-out flowers screamed overcompensation. Bee dished herself some green salad while Irv sat quiet, hands resting flat beside his knife and fork. He stared past her shoulder and out the window a room away, seemed lost in a thought he could not share, the one topic they could not touch. Honey, have some ratatouille, she said. It's Sadie's tomatoes and the squash that man at the garden gave me. Chattering, the way wives do, filling empty air. She exhaled, took a bite of her salad, and shut up to let Irv think it out, the crunch of romaine echoing through her head. Other wives didn't have to chatter on about vegetables. Dear, how was your day at work? This question would never get a straight answer in the Bloom house. Bee sometimes thought on nights like tonight that Irv grew so tired of talking all day, talking and more to the point listening, that he craved nothing more than quiet. He rarely watched TV or listened to the radio after supper. Often he sat right here in his dining room chair in his Speedo briefs, no music, drinking beer and reading a sports section. Quiet. Bee found herself recalling the first time she took Irv home to Pennsylvania to meet her Quaker family. He was a student then, an atheist, but curious about Quakers, their politics and their meetings, so they took him to one. Their meeting house had a reputation for popcorn, too much talking, people standing up simultaneously to express. But on the Sunday they went, no one stood up till near the hour's end, when old Mrs. Paxton struggled to her feet and said, "Today is my husband's birthday. I'm grateful for the time I had with him." This, as a finale to the human sounds, the rearranging of legs and feet, the clearing of throats, the child sniffles, and Bee could picture Mr. Paxton sitting in the empty spot next to his wife's usual place, clearing his own throat and arranging his own feet. Bee had been overcome with a longing for a husband of her own, Irv, maybe even. Irv must have had a similar thought because he had looked a little teary when Bee turned to shake his hand and close the hour. He seemed confused, she recalled, at the formality of the handshake. Weren't they lovers after all? But he rolled with it, clasped both of his enormous hands around hers. What kind of wife had old Mrs. Paxton been? Was she a chattering wife, filling up the supper table with empty talk, the daily recap of job and school? No, didn't seem like her. Did she grow her own tomatoes and discuss them? And Mr. Paxton, did he lose himself out the window like Irv did now after a hard work day? Hon, you remember that time I took you to the Friends meeting in Philly and an old woman stood up to talk about her late husband? Irv's brain seemed to return to the room, his eyes to his plate. I don't quite remember a woman. I remember the meeting, though. Oh, here she thought they had experienced the same thing. I remember how loud all the coughing and sneezing became, and when you shook my hand, he shook his head. A handshake. Oh, I was so in love with your hand. Was? Bee chewed. Irv sighed, looked around, noted the empty chairs with a nod. Did Sadie call? No, not yet today. She sipped her wine. How is Nina? If you like, I'll wake you up tomorrow when she calls. She'd love to talk to you. Bee didn't answer. Her mouth was full. Bee, she thinks you're angry with her. Bee swallowed. That's just silly. I'm not angry with her. Are you sure? He had that maddening therapist mind reader look on his face. Okay, don't shrink me. Just wake me up tomorrow. That's it.
Thank you all. Yes. I love hearing these stories. And again, like we were saying last night, three very different discussions of borders, but three very powerful works, each in their own right. And we've gotten some lovely comments as well in the chat. So people have definitely been enjoying hearing these today. So I'm going to, in a moment, we'll bring in Deborah and some others potentially for our conversation. But Claire, if you want to start off our discussion a little bit.
Sure. So first I have to say, I know exactly the brand cereal that poor Bee was trying to consume, and it always tastes like mulch. And does anyone, before I ask I always have a prepared question for everyone. Before I jump into my first one, does anyone else have a thought or a question? Okay, I'm just gonna move right to my questions then. So Sue, actually Anne was in this conversation too. We recently had, was part of the Gather event. We had a conversation about the pandemic and how it was sort of affecting our writing, and we all sort of came to the conclusion that we probably weren't ready to write about the pandemic yet because we didn't really understand sort of where we are in it. But then I was struck by your essay, which is, you don't come to any conclusions. You don't say what it all means. It's more just in the moment and how you're sort of wrestling with this new reality. It's almost an essay, in which you're writing about how to write about the pandemic. It's like, because you're trying to figure out what it means in real time. And I really like that feeling. It's almost a kind of a meta exercise. And I just wondered if that's how you are thinking about the essay as well, or if you just want to talk about, why you decided to sort of chart what was going on in this way that you did.
I wonder if, thank you for those observations, because it's got me thinking in a new way, in some new ways. I don't know if it's because I'm working on a memoir that stretches back to childhood, and I've been wrestling with it for years. And actually, what I've done in this essay, which I didn't know that I was going to do when I set out, is I only have to cover like 6 months, and it just happened. You know what I mean? I'm not like researching and trying to draw up the traumatic past or something. It's the traumatic present. And but yes, and another thing that I think the piece is sort of about, but you're making me think maybe I could slip this in somehow, is that I'm kind of tormented by, which I think essayists can be tormented in this way, by the like other consciousness that's always on my shoulder, looking over my shoulder and saying, well, you think it's this, but is it really this? And, don't you want to reconsider that right now? Which this pandemic, I mean, we're reconsidering it every day. There's new scientific evidence. There's new, how do I maneuver my own body through the landscape now? And how do I control my thoughts about this as someone who's prone to anxiety and my thoughts running away with me? So your question, the way you frame it's really interesting to me. And I think I'm going to, do some more work with this and think about all that a little bit more.
That's great. Thank you. Go ahead, Jen.
I have to say, Sue, amen on so many levels with your essay. I think you are speaking to something that we are all struggling through in a very relatable way. So thank you. Yes, I agree. And I dare say I've had little snatches of those same thoughts, you renegade anti-masker and things like that. Things like that will come through my head. So thank you for daring to say what many of us are thinking.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I've said this, I don't know, 100 times, but people who don't write think that those of us who do come up with something to write. We think about something, and if you're an essayist, you decide how you think about something, and then you sit down and you write that essay. But that's not how it's done. Like you figure out what is going to happen or how you think about something by doing the writing itself. So it's a piece that really makes the reader or the listener understand that process, which I love about it. I really love writing that makes me think about what that art making actually is.
Well, and I've heard a lot of writers say, and then Anna, to you, how, we can't focus. We can't, I'm like running out every several times a day. Let me just shovel some more mulch, because it's this, very sort of hyperactive mind. And it's hard to get settled also.
I just want to say there's something very alive about writing about the moment, inside the moment, that if you were to write from a position of distance, I don't know another word for it. It feels alive to me.
I did sort of naturally veer into the present tense early on. And I was like, oh, okay, yeah, I could do this in the present tense, because it's happening, it's unfolding, which I think is how we've all been feeling.
Absolutely. Yeah. So Jen, I read a longer version of your piece, and you cut out some things that didn't make it to the final. So my question is a little bit more appropriate to what I read, but you did hint at it. There was a little bit in there. And what I was interested in, it's a very, very tiny part of the story, but the way that you showed the mother and her child relationship. So Marianne's attitude toward her son, apparently a very understandable attitude toward her son. But you are so, it's almost brutal for the way that she talks about her son, the honesty of that relationship. And I really like that. I like the honesty of that. I like how you don't flinch from showing, really how she feels, and that you don't sort of allow her to soften her thoughts about him. So I wanted to give you a chance to talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Well, not every person is nice or polite. And I kind of think it's important to write about very real people. And her reaction to her child actually comes from, people that I've seen in real life who live in similar situations and have kids that they don't dare say what they're really thinking, but they struggle with these kids. A lot of them are opioid addicts who live with them, and maybe their young families live with them. And so during this time, the role of grandparent is often flipped right on its head, where the grandparent may actually be acting as the parent to the grands. And, it's a really tough situation. And so we also want to be careful not to deify motherhood. It's not this beatific thing. Sometimes it's ugly and it's rough, and hearts are broken and grudges are formed. And so there is a divide between her and her son, because mostly of what he's done, his poor choices leading to him being unable to take care of himself. But you do see her loving him in so much that she does let him live with her. So she is conflicted about that, which probably adds to her bitter feelings a little bit.
Oh, I think that's very well done. All right. Oh, Deborah, I'm sorry. I forgot to say hi to you. How are you doing?
Hi. I snuck in at the last minute. I was very worried about getting the acoustics thing.
Oh,
together.
no.
It was really interesting to me how gardens and spouses both sort of snuck their spouses, whether they were present right there or whether they weren't, kind of leaked into that. And the gardens. And yes, Anne, you made me want tomatoes for dinner. Now I have to go to the store and buy tomatoes. So I blame it on you. You did also, Anne, capture so well what therapists go through. As a psychologist, I get home and I don't want to talk. I don't want to think. I want to do mundane, boring things. And I've always been in this situation where my spouse is in the opposite thing and hasn't spoken to anyone all day. So that makes for an interesting dynamic. Shut up, I love you. What really kind of led you to that person's story?
I had a neighbor down the street who had that set up in his home, where he was seeing clients in the home, and they had to walk through the home to get to the space where they worked. And so my husband and I visited there, and I was like, I kept thinking about how much must be for the rest of the family, that there's this boundary inside your own home, mm-hmm. that you're not supposed to hear what goes on in there or talk about it, and with good reason, but people need to have their own lives in the home. And my father is a minister, he's not a therapist, but he had boundaries like that too, where he was receiving confidences from people that were heavy, and he carried those home with him, but he could not talk about them. And so how do you support a person who has that going on in their work? You have to compartmentalize your life. So I just thought it was an interesting scenario for fiction as a kind of a what if, and then mm-hmm. and then I asked around and stuff like that. But mm-hmm. yeah.
Neat.
Thank you, though. I'm not a therapist myself, so it's gratifying to hear that I caught at least some of the feelings that they have. Yeah.
You did.
Go ahead, Jen.
Were you calling on me?
Yeah.
Okay, I live in a situation similar to yours where like it, you know, sometimes I have to just shut up and let my husband's a minister as well. And you know, I have to kind of intentionally stay out of things, or there are things that I can't know about. And yeah, I get it. Like chattering on about useless random things while they stare off into space is definitely.
Go ahead, Sue.
Yeah, it's just very interesting because my partner is a therapist and has started Zooming from home for his work. And I totally get at the end of the day, there's nothing left. You know, he is definitely, his emotional well has run dry.
I like the garden references too. It's not lost on me that the family name is Bloom. And also I thought the trade of vegetables was quite interesting. The woman was offering a juicy tomato and the man was offering a nice zucchini. Just saying. I'm assuming there's more blooming in that garden than just vegetables. So I will look forward to more information on that. But I wanted to ask you about the image of Irv in his little Speedo underwear sitting at the dining table, which just makes me laugh. And I feel like it says an awful lot about Irv that he wants to sit in little Speedo underwear at the dining table. And it says a lot about Bea, and it says a lot about their marriage. But I'm sure it says different things to me than it says to other people, right? So it just, I think about this a lot with my fiction. I think I err in the direction of not, because I'm always avoiding telling. I always want to show. And I think I err in the direction of not telling enough sometimes. I leave a lot of gaps and I feel very comfortable with that. I know some writers who feel upset if readers don't see a character in exactly the way they hoped or the way that they see them. If they get a different feeling from the ending of a story, if they take a different message away than the writer intended, it really bothers them. And it's very rare for that to bother me. I'm perfectly happy for people to have completely different feelings about my characters and my stories. Almost always. It's very rare that a different interpretation will make me go back, to the story, because now I'm concerned, how someone took it. And so I'm just wondering, because this is exactly the kind of thing that a lot of people would have very different reactions to. And I was wondering how comfortable you are with that. When you choose to show like that and not tell, do you feel okay knowing that people are going to have very different feelings about those characters?
I'm naive. I think I assume everybody's just going to think the same thing I'm thinking. And if I'm omitting information, it's often accidental and not intentional. So to me, the thing that it is a leap, I do cut some explanations and intentionally just show a lot. But to me, the most terrifying possibility is that someone will think that I am being facetious or that I'm writing satire of some kind when I'm really being quite sincere. And in a case like this image of Irv sitting in his Speedo on a hot day reading the newspaper, I was actually quite sincere. And then, I read it later and I think, well, somebody might think that's I'm making fun of him. But I'm just like one of these earnest people who doesn't realize that how things might be taken by other people. It's I guess I have to live with it. It is what it is.
Well, let me reassure you that I did not think you were making fun of him. It's a funny image to me. It says things to me about Irv and about their home life and their relationship. It says a lot of things. But no, I didn't think that you were ridiculing him. I did take him as a serious character.
Oh, good.
Go ahead, Jen.
I saw that more as her being very comfortable. Like that was a cue of the comfort level in their relationship, even if they can't verbally say everything they want to say. Now, with the tomatoes and zucchinis, they're not maybe, we haven't entered that yet. But to think of a guy running around in the house in his undies, and the kids laughing at the chest hair and stuff, that definitely just seems like they're comfortable. That's all I took it as.
Well, and to me, I've written a tiny amount of fiction compared to the amount of poetry that I've written, but that's one of the magic things about fiction is your character tells you, yeah, I wear Speedos at the dining room table. You could try and write that guy wearing pants at the dining room table and you'd stop and go back and go, no, it's got to be the Speedos. That's just magical to me about fiction. I really admire you guys who write fiction. You're listening to that voice that's telling you, yeah, this guy is all about the Speedo underwear. And you're not making fun of him. It's just, he's told you that that's what he is. And it's amazing to me.
It's great.
Right. Yeah, on that note, we're actually coming right up on our time. So I think we'll wrap up the reading for today. But I just want to say one more time to Jen, Sue, Anne for today, and Deborah and Jason yesterday as well. Thank you just for sharing your work with us. It's always something to take a piece that you've written, and especially this event, some pieces with, I think, very personal connections, and then to share those with an audience. But I know just how much that means to people who get to hear this, and for me and Claire who get to do this month after month and just get to spend so much time with so many wonderful writers. So thank you for doing that. And thank you also to everyone who tuned in yesterday and today, or who comes back to these videos after the fact. Thank you for taking the time to listen to these writers and just spend a little time with us. Thank you to Courtney and Quiet City for the steadfast support of this series and for providing a place for the arts to continue, especially in the time of a pandemic when I think we need it as much, if not more than ever. And also finally for the Lewiston Public Library, who it co-sponsors and also supports what we're doing here. So we will be back next month with another reading and more readers for you. And also next week, LA Arts is doing a digital art walk for the Lewiston Auburn arts community, and Local Writers Read is happy to be part of that as well. So stay tuned for the LA Arts online channels where they'll be posting things. And we hope to see you all again. Everyone enjoy your weekend, and thanks for coming out.
Hey, thank you.
Thanks. Great job,
Bye.
guys. Amazing work.
Thanks.
Wonderful.